Sports. My name is Manny Osaba. I'm from Jupiter, Florida, and I'm finishing up my master's with the sports management program this summer. I've been an FSU diehard my entire life. That's why I'm honored and excited to tell you about a campaign we have involving FSU sports analytics. I'm leading this initiative through the FSU Coaches Clubs to raise funds for several of our women's sports programs that were affected by COVID-19 budget cuts. That's why we need your support to keep sports science technology like Whoop bands, vert, and catapult vests on the field and in use. Investing in sports analytics is one of the best investments at this university. Whether we're maximizing the work rate of our players or resting them at key moments, it's all about working smarter, not harder. I hope you can join us in making FSU a leader in sports science. Support this campaign at fsucoachesclubs.com. And as always, go Noles.
Hey Abe, thank you for joining us. We have just a couple of questions for you today, and we're really excited to have you and kind of get your insight and knowledge and a little bit more background information. So I wanted to go ahead and start out by getting a little bit of background info on kind of your education and your career path. Where did you start and how did you get where you are today?
Right. It's actually kind of interesting because I would say I kind of had a non-traditional path into this space. I started out my college career at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Happened to graduate a semester early, actually. And I kind of had a lot of different majors. I didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do. I always was a big sports fan, loved sports, played them as long as I could at a sort of semi-competitive level, kind of peaked in high school, like I'm sure a lot of people did. But I started out, I was a geography major in college, also a political science double major, and I minored in history. So really kind of came at it from a lot of different angles. Obviously, I don't necessarily recommend that if you want to go into this space, but I do think as you meet more and more people in the space, you start learning that people come from a lot of different backgrounds to be able to, do certain things depending on exactly what you want to do, whether that's sports media, whether that's, working for a team, maybe that's working in sort of a hybrid role where you're kind of covering teams in a more analytical lens. And I think that has been an important part of sort of my story as well. I have always felt like I always had kind of a diverse level of knowledge. And, geography, again, is not something that you would necessarily say, why does that matter? But if you think about it, a lot of geography, at least in the modern sense, is building out data visualized maps, right? Just going to Google Map, just Google, just pulling it up and you see there's a lot of different things. It's inherently a data visualization. And, Kirk Goldsberry, that's actually his background, who's, very big in the plotting NBA space, where he's basically used some of the techniques he learned in his geography background to kind of basically map the basketball court. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen those sort of hexagram documents that he's able to do. And, that's the power of visualization is, hey, it makes things a lot simpler to sort of understand. It's one thing to see it in a spreadsheet. It's a whole other thing to see it, in a colorful image or sort of with a lot of different density of backgrounds and everything like that, really emphasizing things. So I think it's one of those things where, for me, again, it sort of quote unquote worked out, but I think that should be sort of encouraging that you don't necessarily have to go to a sports management program or don't necessarily have to be a computer science major to be able to accomplish some of the things that you may want to be able to do in this space. Now, again, obviously, that doesn't mean that would be the suggested path, but I guess that's one of those things where as long as you sort of glean what you need to glean and, always are sort of in learning mode, then I think that really does go to show that, you can come from certainly a very traditional background, maybe your sports management or your computer science backgrounds, but as long as you're sort of always in knowledge mode and you're able to pick up different skill sets from a variety of different backgrounds, you can really do whatever you happen to want in this space. Again, whether that's media, whether that's working for a team, whether that's covering gambling or somewhere in between. I think that, again, as long as you're able to pick up skills along the way, you can still sort of accomplish what you want to accomplish in this particular space.
Absolutely. And I really love that you led off with a non-traditional education. That was actually my very next question for you. I am pursuing a graduate degree in business analytics. I hope to go directly into analytics after graduation. So I would say that's a pretty typical path. But as you were saying, you have a non-traditional education for an analyst. Do you really think you need the education specifically as an analyst? And do you think not having that exact specialized degree has kind of given you a different perspective than other people who maybe have gone for that super specialized role?
Right. I think can be six of one, half dozen of the other, really. I think, like, to use your example, right? I think when people think about working for a team, they're like, oh, that means you're basically the general manager, or you're the coach, or the manager, or an assistant coach, or something like that, offensive coordinator. But if you really think about it, most sports teams, again, if you want to say that you work for a football team, for example, they have an HR department, they have business, they have ticket salespeople. Like, there are a lot of different jobs within that space. So maybe you're like, you kind of start off your journey and you're like, yeah, I'd really love to, be just like in my fantasy team. And I really just want to, make trades and sign players and all this different stuff. But when you really take a step back and you start realizing, like, let's say, for example, you were to go on Teamwork Online, which is where a lot of the teams post their jobs. You'll find that most jobs are not, there's only 32 NFL general managers, for example, right? But every team, let's say, has a lot of different scouts. They have a lot of different people in sales. They have a lot of different people that are sort of helping other sides of the business that you may find as you get deeper and deeper into it that, oh, this is actually what I'm passionate about. Again, using your business analytics background, maybe, you take a step back and you say, I'm really fascinated in how dynamic ticket pricing works, right? Obviously, you don't have to be a super big sports fan to realize that tickets closer to the court are more expensive than the ones further out. There's also been a lot of stuff done, with suites, right, around, let's say, a basketball court that also dictate sales. But they're also getting into now, as we live in this increasingly big data world, where, okay, let's say if you're a Major League Baseball team, a weekend series against the Yankees is probably going to be really high demand. So we should jack our ticket prices up because people want to go see the Yankees. Whereas a midweek series against a non-divisional opponent might not necessarily have the highest demand. So they kind of just want people to get into the ballpark. So again, that might be where you sort of dictate your path. Again, as you learn more and more about the space, that might sort of dictate what you happen to be the most interested in. And again, I think that's one of those things where, as you mentioned, it's as you learn more things, you kind of find more things you don't know about. And part of that is just simply gaining more and more knowledge. But some of that is just becoming more and more informed about the particular space that you happen to be passionate about. And that's something that, again, when I sort of quote unquote started out my journey, I didn't even know my job existed. I just kind of, worked really hard, learned more and more about the space, and sort of, again, obviously there's always going to be a lot of luck involved in anything you do, a lot of luck, a lot of learning, and a lot of hard work. And where those all kind of intersect is kind of how you end up sort of finding yourselves into particular positions. And that certainly was true in my case.
Absolutely. And again, you keep hitting on some really great points kind of to my next question, and then we can go into speaking a little bit more about your role day to day. Having that non-traditional background or education, what have you, what did school and kind of your professional experience not prepare you for, and how have you been able to learn on the job and leverage the resources and people around you?
Right. No, I think that's an excellent point, because I think it really is sort of, as I've gotten more and more involved in the space, you sort of inherently learn more and more about what has kind of worked for people and what hasn't necessarily worked. And I think for me personally, I mentioned my non-traditional start earlier in our talk here today, but I would say something else that kind of motivated me was basically the first way I got to start in the space, again, because I have that obvious sports management background or analytics background, was I started off working for the radio station at my local college. And that was kind of how I got into quote unquote sports media. And I was covering town hall meetings, which, if anyone has ever gone to one, they're not riveting, they're not interesting. It was just like hey, I wanted to get some internship experience. I always grew up kind of listening to the radio, frankly, as old as that makes me sound, and was always kind of fascinated by the space. And then you kind of realize, like, oh, well, there's a lot of people who do sports talk radio, again, because it's such a powerful medium. So again, it's sort of really just taking any opportunity you can get. And I think that, again, if you don't have that obvious background, it's really just taking advantage of opportunities, because, again, experience is where you're always going to be able to learn it. And I think that anyone who has been in a position of hiring can tell you that experience is always going to be super important. So it might mean making a certain sacrifice school-wise. Maybe it's, taking one less course a semester, but then being able to intern And I know like colleges, I know that's changed since when I was growing up. Because when I was in school, you could do unpaid internships, and that was kind of a thing. And I think that's becoming less and less so. And it's obviously a good thing because, obviously in a lot of different things that we go through. And I think if 2020's taught us anything, right, it's that there's been a certain amount of privilege in a lot of different things. And some of that you need to be aware of your own personal amount. And then it's playing all the cards in your deck. And if you're able to do that, then that's great. But not everyone is able to do that. So it's okay if I'm not able to do that. Okay, what can I do that is paid? Maybe I need to sort of be able to support myself throughout school. And if I do need to do that, okay, how can I do that? And then B, how does that necessarily translate to where I do want to get to? Because again, there's going to be certain things that are non-tangible skills that you can still learn in any job. If I would say communication is a huge one, right? And how do you necessarily prove that you're a great communicator? Part of that is you're in the interview, right? You're sort of always selling yourself, whether that might be and what you're good at to whatever job you particularly want. But, it's really kind of making what you're able to do and proving it. So let's say, for example, again, waiting tables is a classic college job, right? Let's say, again, you need to, pay for some books and stuff like that. Well, what are you doing when you're serving tables, right? You're thriving in a high-paced environment. You're having to communicate with people with a lot of different backgrounds, and you're having to manage a lot of different things. So all of those things are going to show up in basically every sports job description you get. Another thing I'll add would be working non-traditional hours. Every single one of those is going to show up in almost every single sports job description that you see. And again, you wouldn't necessarily think that, waiting tables or working at a restaurant would translate to that. But again, look on Teamwork Online and everything's going to say that. Because again, sports go on, whether it's Christmas, whether it's Thanksgiving, whether it's Sunday night, whether it's Saturday morning, right? So
Absolutely.
It's really, I think, being able to prove how you can do things without just saying like, hey, I'm a hard worker. Hey, I'm a great communicator. It's, listen, I communicated with 250 people every Saturday night when I was at the local drinking establishment. And again, it's sort of tying in ways that you're able to do things successfully. And I think that's, again, if you don't have that traditional background, that's going to be something that's key. And that's, again, something everybody can do. But it's really trying to be able to sell yourself and really be able to tie in things that you're good at. And everyone's kind of really good at a lot of different things, right? It's just kind of tying it in and how it fits into your particular story and your particular puzzle.
Absolutely. And I think that point is really applicable when people are making resumes, kind of being able to pull out exactly what you did and what's applicable to your future role. So now that we have a little bit of a background on kind of your education and career path, what do you actually do? What does a typical day for you look like day to day? And what kind of does your role entail?
Right. So my specific job, I basically work at a company called Sportradar, and we are a sports data company. A lot of you probably haven't heard of us. We're actually a European company traditionally, but we've kind of made a lot of different movements into the United States the last 10 years or so. We basically are the official data provider for all of the big four sports. So that's MLB, NFL, NBA, and NHL. And we also deal with NASCAR and a lot of different other stuff. Some more background, so Sportradar is a European company by nature, and in Europe, this is actually something that's changed rapidly in the last 3 or 4 years in the United States. But sports gambling was just was not nearly as taboo as it was here in the States as little as 10 years ago. So that was kind of how Sportradar made its mark in the European space and the international space was that. And they were like, listen, we see on the horizon that this is going to change in the United States. Huge appetite for sports passion. And we think this is going to, so they kind of made their move, and we're doing fairly well in the space, obviously, as you've seen, because we're the official data provider for all these different big American sports, and most of them, with the exception of maybe basketball and a little bit of hockey, technically, that most of them are very American sports. The NFL is not that big internationally. So I think basically what I do is I support the broadcasts. Our main client is Fox Sports. So that's not only, Big Fox, where the NFL is every Sunday during the fall, also college sports, both football and basketball, but also for, I think, about 2/3 of the NBA, NHL, and NBA is also a Fox Sports regional network, which will soon be rebranded as Bally's Sports Network. But basically, if you see a graphic on the screen of a NFL game or an NBA game, and it's, let's say, for example, the most 25-point games in the NBA this season, there's a pretty good chance that it's come from either myself or somebody on my team, or with some of the various websites tooling that we are able to sort of provide to these broadcasters. So obviously, as I mentioned before, we talk about working in a fast-paced environment. I don't know that there's a much more fast-paced environment than live television. A lot of things can go wrong, and I'm still amazed, even as someone who's been in the business for 5 years or so, that it goes as well as it does, especially like the last year has been almost entirely remote. So it used to be people would be at the stadium for the most part, but now for a large part of it, it's just the broadcasters are there, and you have people that are running audio and graphics and video are doing it from their home locale, and they're not traveling. But basically what I do is I sort of do between a lot of different processes, but basically what I'm doing is data mining interesting trends, just like you would be if you were working at a Fortune 500 company. But instead of coming up with KPIs or PE ratios, I'm coming up with, passing yards per game and interesting insights around all that kind of different stuff. And I think, the graphics is really the biggest part where that goes, but a lot of times it will just be something where the announcer has said it, right? Okay, this is, for example, Travis Kelce had a record-breaking year this last year. And, so him in particular, he had the most receiving yards by a tight end. So as soon as that happened, the broadcaster knew it. And as soon as it happened, he was able to say it on air. And that's something that, as we've become more and more statistically aware of a lot of different trends, that has become more and more a part of live sports television. You watch sports television from 30, 40 years ago, and basically the entire screen was just blank. And, every 3 or 4 minutes, you'd see either the score flash or, if it was baseball, maybe you'd see balls and strikes. But now you always have a sport bug graphic up. You almost always have, a bottom line where there are other scores from around the league or other news. So it's really just changed a ton. And that's before you even get to the tip of iceberg with gambling, because I think none of us really know where that's going. And that's going to be, I would say, if the 2020 is going to be anything for the sports broadcast space, it's really going to just be, how is gambling able to be handled?
Awesome. A little bit more on the data side. Where do you actually get your data? I don't assume that you're going out and Googling every single time that you kind of need to find an answer. Can you give us a little bit of insight to that? Talk about some of the direct insights that you provide and who would actually use those insights.
Right. So I think there's two main ways, right? So one, as you might imagine, we have a huge database with tons of different individual databases for every sport. So we might have a particular database that has a team's season statistics. Let's use Major League Baseball, for example, because it's probably the most statistically based one. We have a database that has every team's season stats, going back to the 1800s, every player's season stats. And then, we have tons of different databases for how they do on a game by game level. So everything they've done in every individual game, everything they've done and then, that can be broken down even further to how they do in a particular inning, how they might do with runners in scoring position. And, at least for me, probably the highlight of my career so far was being able to be in the bubble with Fox Sports for this last MLB postseason. So that was for the NLCS and for the World Series. And as you can imagine, you're kind of jumping in between different hoops of, okay, we have things that we have in our database. We really want to be forward thinking and proactive because, again, you're in live television. You have to react to everything going on at once. And we also have an internal website that we utilize that, again, also the broadcasters are able to use. It's basically just like a supersized version of Baseball Reference or Football Reference, if you're familiar with those, or any of the sports pages that you're able to come up with on ESPN.com, and a variety of other internal tools that, again, we're able to sort of, if you have any kind of computer science background or any data background, we're using, tooling that I'm sure other places are also using for, again, a variety of other different things. So it's really just kind of leveraging all that and, again, being as proactive as possible because, again, you are in live television. So you don't have the luxury of like, okay, I can get that in an hour. No, you need to have it in 10 seconds. So it's sort of balancing the pregame preparation aspect with the in-game live television aspect, which, it can be difficult at times and stressful. But again, it's one of those things where it pays off in the end when you're able to get an opportunity like I was. And, again, highlight of my career so far. And I may have already kind of hit the total one. So we'll see how it goes from there. But that's certainly, again, was exciting, but also very nerve-wracking because, again, you're on live television effectively for 4 hours feeding statistics to announcers, and if the stat is wrong, you're not going to feel very good. And fortunately, I was able to get through that error-free. But again, there's a lot of aspects of that can potentially go wrong. It's again, communication is big, being proactive is big, being able to multitask is big. Again, to what I mentioned, that's something you can learn at any job. So, and it's something that I think it's important to try to balance a lot of different things because it will be able to manifest itself in some of the more high-stress opportunities.
Absolutely. You hit on a really great point of kind of pre-game prep. How do you come up with what you're going to, or rather, how do you anticipate what's going to be asked or what you already need to know? Is that just from experience, or can you give us any insight to that?
Let's just say you're watching a particular sporting event on television, and even if you're just a casual sports fan, I think you always are going to ask yourselves, fundamentally, is this something that has happened before, right? I think the joke about baseball is that there's always a different thing that happens in every game, and that's sort of the crux of really what we're targeting when we're kind of looking for that particular information. So, for example, during the World Series, things that don't happen that often, even in the homer-happy MLB environment that we're in now, it's okay. Let's say how many people have had a 2-homer game in baseball, in the World Series, and that can sort of show in a lot of different angles, right? So it's okay. There's been kind of a lot of players that have hit 2 home runs in a World Series game, but not a ton. So you're already sort of joining a unique club. Okay, well then it's how can we really sort of, and again, you're kind of selling yourself, but you're also kind of selling your idea as well. So let's say, for example, Cody Bellinger hit 2 home runs in a World Series game. So what immediately comes by is, okay, how relevant is this in MLB history? So like what I mentioned before, okay, there's kind of a lot of players who have hit 2 home runs in a game, but not a ton. But let's see if we can kind of make it a little more interesting. So something that might jump out is, okay, the Dodgers, right, have had an illustrious history of, being in the World Series. Unfortunately for them, for the most part, it's been losing in the World Series, but they were able to pull it out in 2020. Okay, so there's a lot of great names that have played in Dodger history, right? You got Roy Campanella and Jackie Robinson, and obviously Kirk Gibson has his famous home run. So you're kind of just trying to tie things in historically, especially for a sport like baseball, where history is so important to the zeitgeist of the entire sport. So, okay, back to my example, Cody Bellinger hits 2 home runs. Okay, how many Dodgers have hit 2 home runs in a World Series game? Obviously a lot fewer than all across Major League Baseball. Okay, so maybe let's say we have a list of 7 or 8 players. We're still kind of trying to weed out some of them, obviously. Even in baseball, there's probably some, frankly, not good players that aren't that interesting. So, okay, let's make it a little more interesting. So, all right, so Cody Bellinger's hit 2 home runs. Okay, let's look at Dodgers outfielders to hit 2 home runs in a game. Okay, so maybe it's just Cody Bellinger and Duke Snider and, maybe one other, again, maybe Kirk Gibson, for example. Okay, that's a pretty awesome list, right? That's 2, one Hall of Famer, one guy who arguably hit the most famous home run in baseball history, and another player who's, an awesome young star MVP a couple years ago. So again, it's really just kind of fine tuning it to what might be the best angle. Because again, okay, maybe he's the youngest Dodger to hit 2 home runs in a World Series game. Again, that's also pretty interesting because again, they've had a lot of great players to play for them. And you can think on the other side of the coin, Tampa Bay doesn't have that great of a history. They've made the World Series one time. They don't have a lot of huge name players. So it's kind of a little more difficult to come up with that. Obviously, kind of the crown jewel is, let's say, Yankees, Dodgers, where you have a lot of different big names. You can get guys on lists with Mickey Mantle and Joe DiMaggio and Babe Ruth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a mix of, what they're going to ask about, but then it's also really being able to fine tune and hone it to make it particularly interesting to the viewer that says, oh, wow, I just saw something that's really interesting. I just saw, oh yeah, I was watching that game where Cody Bellinger was the youngest Dodger to hit 2 home runs. I remember seeing it on the broadcast that I happened to be watching. So it's really just kind of trying to make every game unique, every game important. And, again, for the World Series, obviously some of that's selling it itself, but it's also, some of the World Series you go back, they haven't been quite as interesting as other ones. Obviously this one was super interesting because of how many back and forth games there happened to be. So that, again, was a big storyline. But again, it's really just trying to tie in and getting the broadcasters excited and also getting the fans at home excited to see something that maybe hasn't happened before or is the most historically significant thing to happen. So really that's kind of what you're really looking for. Obviously that can't happen all the time. Sometimes you're going to get kind of a 4-2 snoozer game that you still have to find information for, but it's really kind of when those historical moments happen that you can really sort of start to get the point across and really start to try to help with the broadcasts.
That's awesome. Additionally, a little bit more specific into your role, who do you collaborate with internally? Do you have a team of people, or is it kind of just you from start to finish with the analytics?
Right. So I think this is something that in a lot of different, I've worked for 3 companies now in the sports media space, and it's all been a little bit different. I would say for one, on the more analytical side, as we kind of traditionally talk about it, right? Like, so for baseball, that might be like pitch type information. For football, obviously like the NFL next gen stats are really big. And like basketball, they have a lot of tracking stuff now with Second Spectrum, et cetera. So it really kind of depends. For example, for my particular role, I happen to be a little more inclined to the analytics of it all. So that's, again, like reading up on things like next gen stats from the NFL and reading up and making sure I'm aware of anything coming out of the big data bowl is another big one again. So that's kind of my role, is kind of to learn more on the analytics. And that's a little bit more of a silo where I'm not totally on my own, but certainly I'm kind of in more of a leadership position to be able to do that and sort of disseminate the information throughout the team. But other stuff, like say, for example, when I'm in the World Series, I'm on a headset, I'm listening into the broadcast, I'm listening into the broadcast truck. From the Fox Sports side of things, they have a broadcast associate who's kind of coordinating everything. Obviously, they have the announcers who are doing stuff. Even just something as simple as, and again, this is to speak how sort of low tech this job can be at times. I'm literally writing down this information on a note card, handing it to Joe Buck's personal statistician, and he's sort of running it over to Joe Buck at a particularly good time of the game. So it's super low tech, just writing on an index card, literally. But I'm also, I'm on a headset, I'm in a direct message chat with a few different teammates of mine, and we're just kind of throwing ideas at the wall and kind of trying to see what sticks. For a particularly high profile game, I might be, direct messaging with 3 or 4 different people throughout my team. But on some of, an NFL Sunday, for example, where I'm remoting in from my house, and it might be kind of assigned to one game. So that's kind of where I'm a little more on my own, because obviously on an NFL Sunday, there might be 7 or 8 games going on at one time. You don't necessarily have the full support that you do for an MLB postseason game, or again, an NFL postseason game, where again, it's a little more high profile event. We have millions and millions of people watching. It's a little more important that, things are 100% factually correct. The best data is out there. Again, the best ideas are out there. We're always kind of trying to anticipate between the rest of us. And we have a super talented and super hardworking team. And again, that's something that, teamwork is always, being a team player is always going to be on every job posting, right? So again, even if you're doing something as mundane, perhaps as waiting tables, you say, this is no relevance. Well, okay, you might be taking orders while you have someone else who is cleaning up the dishes in the kitchen, while someone is clearing the tables and cleaning out and making sure that. And you might have a host who's, deciding where everyone goes. So you're working as a team there as well, and you're collaborating with group projects while you're in college, I'm sure. And you're using technology not that dissimilar to what I was using. We happen to mostly use Slack, but obviously Microsoft Teams and all these different, instant messaging services, all the teams use the same stuff. So again, it's just really kind of trying to pitch yourself into what you happen to do. And again, it's something that I think for us on the younger side of the coin, it's a little bit simpler to do the technology stuff, but that's still going to be something that can be a differentiator to you, because again, we use it every day. I think if this last, 365 days has taught us anything, it's that, the collaboration is increasingly going to be over the computer, on Zoom calls, on Slack messages, et cetera, whatever the tool of the next couple of years will be. And you just have to kind of continue to adapt, and you continue to learn the new technologies, because they're not going away.
Absolutely. Adaptability and flexibility. That's a lot that we're hearing about right now.
For sure.
Next question for you. How would you define success in your role? And that can be kind of from a personal perspective, from an organizational perspective. Is that having customers that continue to come back, providing your customers a return on their investment perhaps, or finding out a statistic that no one else was able to?
Right. I think there's kind of 2 ways to look at this. I think one is sort of success in your role in your current role. Because again, we're so customer focused. So one is, how successful are you at sort of maintaining and staying in your role at your company, and how does that manifest itself to the external company? Now, again, in sports media, it's a little bit different than most companies. There's not that many sports media companies out there, much like there aren't that many NFL teams out there, right? So for example, if you look at who broadcasts sports in the United States, it's basically ESPN and Fox and CBS and Turner. and AT&T and a few others, but for the most part there's not that many, right? It's not like, let's say if you wanted to work for a bank, there's hundreds and hundreds of banks across America and across the world as well, that if you don't necessarily love your cultural fit with one, you kind of can just go a few blocks or go a few miles down the street to the next town and you probably find a bank to get a job at, right? Obviously some of those are going to be more centralized and everything, but I would say for me, and again, this is more of the intangible side, but for me within my own company, I always want to be known as the one who works the hardest, who's going to say yes, who's going to do whatever it takes, who's going to burn the midnight oil if that's what's required to get the job done, and who's reliable and also accountable, because you are going to make mistakes. We're all human. So I always kind of looked at it, and again, this is stuff that is not necessarily tangible, right? It's just, you kind of know it when you see it a little bit, right? So it's availability and accountability. And that's okay. Yeah. Let's say, for example, it's 4:55, you get a message in, and all right, my shift is technically over, but okay, do you want to stay an extra and do it? And whether you like it or not, and there's a certain part of that kind of sucks, frankly. But whether you like it or not, people always remember that kind of stuff when you've helped them out in a pinch. And again, that's a non-tangible thing, but it's something that I've found success with throughout my career. And it's easy to say, again, on a resume, everyone's going to say that, but it's another thing to actually do it. And again, that's just something that's been successful for me. And that's not going to mean it's 100% of the time going to just work. It's not necessarily just the people who work the hardest end up getting the best jobs and end up being successful, because I know that's not true, because it's been true for me personally as well. I haven't necessarily gotten everywhere I've wanted to be, but I think it's been a good formula for me, at least for my internal role within the company, is just, listen, that's what I want to be known as. If, again, it's a lot of cliches, but I think a lot of cliches have a certain root of truth, because again, the stuff like skills and all this other stuff, they're awesome, right? But a lot of people have those skills. And, but I think when it comes to it, a lot of those intangible things are some of the stuff that carries more weight, ultimately, again, assuming you have the requisite skills. I'll just add to that secondary part of, okay, what makes us good with our particular role within in our customer service base of like how happy is Fox or some of our other clients with our work. And it's kind of the same thing, but it kind of manifests itself a little differently. It's basically, how can we make their jobs as easy as possible? Because ultimately we work in a customer service environment with a limited number of customers, right? If we, for whatever reason, Fox was not happy with us and wanted to go to a different company, there's another company that can do it right with them and do what we do, right? Because again, it's a pretty high demand particular role. And it's the same thing if you work for a professional sports team where, much like a lot of people on this call, frankly, where there's hundreds of people who want to get these jobs all the time. So it's really hard to get the job. And to a certain extent, it's even harder to keep them. So I think it's, for me, for example, exactly what you're saying, right? It's like, okay, if you think about it this way, when we give someone a statistics to put on air, they ultimately decide whether it's good enough to air. There's oftentimes where we'll give them a stat that we love, and sometimes they don't like it. It happens, right? And people are going to be in a difference of opinion on exactly what's interesting. Sometimes you give them a great stat. Sometimes they love the stat, but sometimes there's just not enough time to get in that particular stat into the broadcast. And, they're kind of bummed, right? Because ultimately it's their job to have a great broadcast, just like it's our job to have great stats and compelling storylines to give them. And just like it's, the commentator and the broadcaster's job to adequately communicate to the audience. There are also times where things will get in the way, but I think ultimately our job is to make them look good. So when they look good and, if their bosses, and again, everyone kind of has a boss for the most part. So if their bosses are like, hey, I love that graphic you were able to put up in the third quarter when Travis Kelce broke the tight end receiving record, it was really timely. It worked in well. The broadcasters were all over it as well. You made the broadcasters look good. Great job. It's okay. Well, at least in part, I would like to hope anyway, at least in part was because, hey, we were on top of it. We were making sure nothing slipped through the cracks, even though I'm sure that they happen to be aware of it. Sometimes it's a reminder. Sometimes it's digging up new information, because we're all on the same team here. All we want to do is get through a broadcast with compelling information that's 100% factually correct. So that's the good thing about how we do, is we're all kind of working the same way, right? That's not necessarily the case with every job, where sometimes you have people rowing in different directions. We happen to be manning the same boat. We're just, we're trying to generally steer in the same exact direction. So I think, fortunately, from my side of things anyway, we're all in the same we're all looking for the same things. Again, when you work for a team, there's going to be times where there's a lot of internal conflict, right? You might have to make a draft pick, and let's say, for example, I think our football team should take a quarterback early, and you, Jackson, you're like, no, we're happy with the quarterbacks on our roster. We need a new receiver that'll make the quarterback look better. And when push comes to shove, the general manager's got to make a decision. And okay, well, maybe he went with the wide receiver, and it's up to me to say, I could take that a lot of different levels, right? It's okay. He doesn't think my opinion is valued. She doesn't think that what I'm doing is good enough. They don't know exactly what they're doing, whatever. Or you can sit down and there's a second round to make a pick, et cetera. So it's there are going to be times where there's conflict. There's going to be times where you just have to go with one decision. And of course, I've been frustrated at times when maybe necessarily I haven't been, listened to or whatever the case may be. But that's part of any job. And I'd say it's especially true in sports because most people in sports have kind of an ego about it a little bit. And that's going to be true, especially at the team level. Everyone thinks they would be a great GM. I mean, heck, every fan thinks they'd be a great GM. So of course the people who work for the teams think they're going to be a great GM. But long and the short of it is, I think that's been one of the ways to be successful is you just have to learn exactly how the bread is buttered. And again, I think for my internal position, it's been a lot of just hard work and being able to go the extra mile. And externally on the customer success things is realizing what they need, becoming as aware as possible of what they come at it and look at. For them, it's not always about having the best stats. Sometimes they need to get advertisements in after quarters that, you're like, why didn't you put my graphic in? But it's like, well, sorry, we had to throw in, the Taco Bell take of the day or whatever. We just didn't have time for it. And it's as you become more and more aware of things, you become more and more understanding of how people operate. And I think that's also been something that I've, at least hopefully anyway, I've been able to translate into where I'm at today.
That's really great. Now that we kind of have a background on you and your role, I'd love to switch a little bit more towards the future of both your job and the industry as a whole. And kind of the elephant in the room, and you did touch on this already, how has coronavirus impacted how you do your job? And what are some of the lasting impacts that are perhaps positive that you think are going to stay, but just generally anything that is going to kind of have switched for the future?
Right. I think the biggest one is that, again, as I mentioned a bit earlier, that it used to be that, TV trucks, and again, there's usually like a dozen people or so for every broadcast that are in the television truck doing a variety of different tasks. And because they had to, out of necessity, basically, most of the broadcasts for the last, year or so have been remote, whether that's the broadcasters as well, but certainly people who are in the television truck. And I think that's going to be something that, unfortunately, for the most part, is going to be kind of here to stay. And I think that's kind of a bummer for certain people. It's not having the same access because, again, I think to most fans, you barely notice a difference. But I think, especially on the broadcaster side, I'm sure, as you've been watching sporting events, I know ESPN, I think in particular, has been good about really communicating with their audience that, hey, our broadcasters are remote, so they're not necessarily going to be 100% on the ball all the time because a lot of times they're getting the same angle as you are getting at home. So, if there's a play in a corner in a basketball game and they're they can't tell who it's off of and they can't necessarily see the referee, it's because of these factors. And again, I think eventually the broadcasters for 90% of things will be in venue. But I think, again, there's always going to be something to that in-person interaction that I think unfortunately will get a little bit lost, except for maybe some of those more high profile events, again, baseball playoffs, basketball playoffs, prime time games in a variety of different sports. But I do think for a lot of these particular sports, a lot of people are going to end up doing things remotely now. And that's, again, it's going to be turning from a coronavirus issue to a cost saving issue. And again, it's 100% understandable because I think that's going to be true for every industry, right? It's not going to be, okay, we need one desk for every person who works here. Maybe it's, for this particular job, we only have half the desks. You kind of come in sometimes, maybe you come in Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I come in Tuesday, Thursday, or whatever. And I think, again, that's just going to be something we're going to have to adapt to. And I'm sure that, everyone watching this has had the same experience with schooling, right? Again, it's tough. I feel for all you all because it's tough to learn stuff remotely. I'd say it's even tougher to do that than it is to work a lot of times because for the most part, when you're working a job, again, not every time, but let's say 80, 90% of the time, you're just doing your own thing. And then you might have, collaborations and stuff. But for you all, it's okay. A lot of schooling now, you don't have that one-to-one with your professors or your teaching assistants, et cetera. And again, I would use that as a positive. Just say, like, to a certain extent, this is the wave of the future in a lot of different industries, whether it's sports or whether, sports kind of remains a hobby for you, that, hey, I was able to adapt well. And, maybe you throw out, okay, my GPA before, my GPA after, or, hey, I was able to do, squeeze in a lot of these different classes, or I was able to take advantage of not having to get on a bus to get to class every day by doing X, Y, or Z. I think there's a lot of different things that are going to come out of this. I would say that's going to be at the forefront. And again, that's a lot of different industries. People are not going to commute nearly as much as they used to because, hey, I can just do all my work from a laptop. So I think this is going to be huge for a lot of different industries. And I would say sports is going to be right at the top of the list in terms of like the percent of people that job descriptions are going to be totally different going forward than they were, let's say, in 2019.
Absolutely. This is on a similar note, but not exactly the same. And you kind of have touched on this again a little bit earlier, but what would you say is the current state of the art in your field? How do you kind of expect that to change in the future, if at all? And what are maybe some of the emerging technologies or items that are on the horizon that you're looking forward to or excited about?
Right. I think, and this is again true with a lot of different industries, is just going to be like big data. Obviously, like sports analytics has changed things on the team side, and we're already at the point of no return, if you want to use that terminology. But I think now we're sort of just learning now, like how powerful that can be with a lot of things, like machine learning generated insights for things that we used to have to look up. And, there's going to be some certain positives. Again, we're kind of in the infancy with stuff like that. But again, it's, just doing anything you would learn how to do, using neural networks to find out particular things, using cluster analysis to compare players. A lot of stuff that I know teams are doing, I think are now going to become more and more prevalent in the broadcast space. And you're already kind of seeing that a little bit. Again, if any of you are on Twitter, obviously every kind of league and sport has their own kind of Twitter community, so to speak. I know a lot of people are kind of collaborating, and people that have a lot, frankly, more data science background than I certainly do, are, creating, packages in R and Python, et cetera, so that things are a lot more democratized than they used to be. And I think there's a lot more of a push and a lot more opportunities now to be able to get involved with that kind of stuff if you're interested in it. And I know not everybody is. And again, it's something I'm kind of learning as we go as well. But I think that's, at least from the very, very soon future, I think is going to be more and more prevalent, is instead of, having people like me, people might look at me even in 5 or 10 years and like, oh man, we used to have a person doing that. Why don't we just run a program to come up with these, there's 2 home run insights that we talked about earlier. If Cody Bellinger hits 2 home runs, I push a button and all of a sudden I get, let's say, 15 of these insights popping up, and maybe my job is just, okay, well, that one's dumb. That one doesn't make any sense. Oh, that's a good one. And then it's just me picking out of something that a computer has generated. Again, I think we're a little bit off from there, but again, we're trying it right now, seeing how it goes. And again, it's all just about, I would say from our point of view, it's less about the quality and more about just like, we don't want to miss anything, because again, you have so much to do when you're in a live television operation that you don't want to miss something just because your brain, if anyone, think of like the most stressful time you've been in, and your brain just doesn't operate 100% because you're having to make split-second decisions. And again, if the computer can at least help us with like either sparking an idea or coming up with an insight all entirely, I think that's, that would be really awesome, and it would help us out, frankly. But again, we're not quite there yet. The other thing I think is just gambling, really. How gambling is going to change every aspect of the business. Obviously, the monies continue to flow in. If anyone has followed, some of the stuff that DraftKings and FanDuel are doing around, opening up new sports books, and William Hill and BetMGM, et cetera, opening up new sports books in new states, and just everything shattering records and shattering expectations everywhere it goes. And I think, just even as something as simple as this year with baseball season, where Bally's is sponsoring basically the sports networks now, and you're going to see a lot of movement. I think they're going to try to make their money back basically with pushing gambling content, because I think the goal is now, instead of having these maybe one-on-one sports debates, hey Jackson, who do you think's going to hit the next home run? It's going to be, okay, well, I'll bet you $10 on who hits the next home run, and I'll be in an app, and I'll tap Mookie Betts, and you tap Cody Bellinger, and then of course Justin Turner hit a home run. We'll both lose money. But I think that's going to come. I think we've already kind of gotten close to that, and it'll be fascinating how each of these networks, because again, it's been interesting. Each network has kind of teamed up with their own gambling background, right? So then it's going to be kind of up to them, and someone's going to do it really well and they're going to make a killing. Somebody's going to do it really poorly and they're not going to do very well, and they're not going to get their money out of their investment. And most people are going to just kind of do it fine, and people will steal ideas as they always do. And there's going to be some really great ideas. There's going to be some really terrible ideas. But I think, again, as someone who has watched sports for a ton of my life, my wife would maybe argue a little too many hours of my life. But I don't see that slowing down. And again, I think they're going to have to make their money back. And basically, for those of you who don't know, the sports model is built entirely on cable television. And I'm sure a lot of you all don't subscribe to cable anymore because it's just not a thing that people do, especially the younger demographic. So as the younger people grow up, they're not used to a world with cable. So why am I subscribing to this? And again, if you think about it this way, the NBA basically makes billions of dollars from ESPN and Turner to put those games on. The players get 50% of that basketball-related income, or BRI. But if the cable television companies aren't doing well anymore, that number is going to go down. Their willingness to pay is going to go down, and the money for the players is going to go down. The money for the owners to make money is going to go down. So how do they fill that void? It's going to be some combination of gambling, and maybe companies like Amazon and Apple and Facebook and Twitter and some of these companies that have experimented with streaming. You know, those are the companies that have money these days. And those are the companies that are going to be able to, Apple has, just ludicrous amounts of money. If they wanted to get into sports broadcasting, they just write a check and they're in, right? They have all the money in the world, maybe more than all the money in the world, frankly. If they want to be in it, they could do it, and they don't mind if they lose a little bit of money, whereas NBC, needs to have Sunday Night Football so that they can advertise for some of their other shows and make their other money that way. It's just a totally different business model. And again, between those three prongs, it's really going to be how the next decade of sports evolves. And again, some people are going to be great at it. Some people are going to do not so great at it. There's going to be some hilariously terrible things done that people are going to mock. But it's really just, at least from my personal point of view, for me, it's just trying to stay ahead as much as possible, learning as much as you can, reading as much of people's opinions on what the future is, and trying to stay up to date as much as possible with all of it. Because again, I'm a little more old school. I love the statistics more than I love the gambling aspect of it. I gamble a little bit just because, again, it's fun to do. But, I care more about the history stuff. Hey, this is, Cody Bellinger's the youngest player to hit 2 home runs in a World Series game for the Dodgers, more than I care about the prop for Cody Bellinger to hit 2 home runs in the game pays out 40-1. And if you bet on that, then you just happen to make $300 because you put, X amount of money on it. But that's more of the future. And the way I find it particularly interesting is kind of, again, going away, because there's not necessarily a way to monetize that. So everything I described is going to be true for every industry, I think. We increasingly live in a world dominated by the tech giants. And, even though Tesla's not super big in the sports industry, certainly a lot of the stuff they're doing across the board is going to be important in a lot of different industries. So no matter what part of the industry you want to do, or if you want to go into a different industry, I think that's all going to be true, no matter whether you like it or not, frankly. It's going to be survive and adapt.
Awesome. You touched on this in that answer, kind of, but I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into the whole automation, AI, ML kind of thing. And you're obviously not an AGI researcher, but in a world where computers took everything over, and perhaps I'm showing my bias a little bit here as well, what parts of your job do you think still kind of would require that human element to determine what's necessary, again, like you said, to not miss something and to maybe understand what's important and exciting to other humans?
Right. I think, and maybe I'm a little bit on the bias side too, I think, at least from where we're at now, is I think we're still, again, because we're in the infancy, I think there's always going to have to be a human looking over it. Again, you can spit out all you want to spit out, but some of it's not going to be, you're not going to necessarily know what is a particularly insightful thing yet. And again, I could see a world where that gets better. But again, as the same thing happened, I'm sure, in 1930 when people were building cars on the assembly line. No, there's no way a robot could ever do this. And then what happens is the robot does 90% of the work, and then there's humans to guide it along and make sure, they don't send a car with, 7 wheels or something like that. But it's mostly as, sort of a quality control process. And I could definitely see us getting to that point where I think we would always want that aspect of it, just because, at least in the sports industry, it's definitely a relationship business, and people sort of want to work with people they're inherently a little more comfortable with. And again, I think based on the industry we work in, there's always going to be sort of an old guard and a new guard in every industry. And it's going to be sort of, I think maybe one of my strengths has always been my ability to learn some of the new guard things, your skills, your technologies, keeping up to date with various information, and also being able to communicate that well. There's tons of people in my own company, let alone in the world, that are way better at computer skills than I am. I would say I'm maybe even below average for people who call themselves data people. But I think one of my strengths is that what I do happen to know, I'm able to communicate it very well to a variety of different audiences. So I think that's always going to be true. It's always going to be big about communication. And the way I think about it anyway is basically, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of different people, right, is when you're at home, my parents are a little bit older, and you always kind of inevitably be kind of the IT department for your home computer, right? It's, the Progressive commercials are great at this, right? It's let's show you how to open a PDF. And it's just like, I've spent so many of my hours of my life doing that. And I think that's actually something that's really helped me out, because again, there's always going to be people with varying degrees of technical skill. There's going to be varying degrees of people with interest as well. And it's one thing to be able to come up with the information. It's a whole other thing to be able to disseminate that both accurately, acutely, and quickly. And again, the quickly, I think this is particularly important in live television. If I just were to send a spreadsheet off, people would look at it and be like, what is this? This doesn't help me at all. How can I use this? So again, that's where some of the data visualization stuff I think really comes in key, because you hear all the time from people who consider themselves visual learners. And I think that's becoming more and more true as we live in a more and more screen-dominated reality. People are a little more used to having infographics when you're reading. It's not just reading the newspaper anymore. It's, we need to have compelling infographics on our things to be able to show people things, because again, people are used to watching cable news on television or coming up with, reading a news article on the internet or whatever. So I think it's important to stay ahead of those things, as I mentioned a few times here, but I do think there's always going to be a place for the communication aspect of it. And I think that's where having an awesome team is really important, because I think as we become more and more specialized, it's impossible to be awesome at all of it, right? I personally have not met anyone who is awesome at the tech stuff, awesome at communicating it, and awesome at organizing it, and a variety of other things that you think about. It's really about it's just like having a baseball team or a football team, right? Patrick Mahomes might be the best quarterback in the NFL, but Patrick Mahomes couldn't play offensive line. He probably couldn't kick. He would probably, he'd probably do fine at running back and maybe decent at receiver. He probably couldn't play defensive end. The same thing is true with Major League Baseball. I guess they're trying with some, guys like Shohei Ohtani, but for the most part, if Mike Trout's awesome, maybe he's the best baseball player, but he probably wouldn't be that good at second base if you asked him to do it. He probably wouldn't be that good at pitching if you asked him to do it. So really that team aspect of it really translates to all the different things. So decide what you happen to be best at and become as good as possible at that aspect of it. If Jackson, for example, you are super interested in some of the computer science stuff, become awesome at R, become awesome at Python, SQL, Tableau, whatever, fill in the blank, whatever your language is, just become awesome at it. If you feel like you're a good communicator, I think it's important to learn some of those things, but become really awesome and really challenge yourself to communicate with people from a lot of different backgrounds, not just age. Maybe that happens to be race, socioeconomic status, whatever the case may be, right? People have all different types of backgrounds. So it's important to be able to communicate with them on their level and have a shared experience with that, be able to communicate that way. And, even things like a project manager, where you're kind of managing all these egos and you're doing all this different stuff. And maybe that's something that just interests you, is just kind of like, hey, I think my skill is being a jack of all trades. I'm not the best coder, but I could do it in a pinch. I'm not the best communicator, but if our quote unquote communication person was out sick, I could step in and be able to do that. And I have a good amount of industry knowledge to be able to really tie this in together with a lot of different groups. And, there's courses and stuff you can do for project manager roles. So I think the important thing is to really just become awesome at what you're good at. Because I think more and more, and this is not always the case, but we're becoming more and more of a specialized society. And I think that's an important thing to be able to adapt to. Again, if you love the computer programming aspect, just rock out. And that even applies within computer programming. I think too often people are like, oh, I need to learn R, and I need to learn Python, and I need to learn Java, and I need to be able to build the website. It's like, it's not super realistic. I mean, maybe you're a wizard, and if that's true, awesome, because you'll be able to get a job anywhere you want, because there's not too many of those unicorns out there. But there's always going to be people, no matter what industry you're in, that are going to require people who program, require people who communicate, require people who are able to sort of manage both egos and tasks in an efficient manner. So it's really just, it's just like operating a sports team where, hey, we're in the draft, our left tackle's not great, maybe our right tackle's okay. It's, self-scouting is almost more important than scouting the rest of the teams in the league. It's so many, how many sports teams have made mistakes with, oh, actually, our left tackle kind of sucks, but actually I think he's good because I drafted him in the first round a few years ago. Let me overpay him to prove myself right. It's the same thing with knowing your abilities. If you know for a fact that you're never going to be that ace computer programmer, yeah, learn enough to maybe understand it and become competent at it. But, don't bang yourself against the wall trying to become the best R programmer. If you know for a fact you've spent, Gladwell has his 10,000 hour thing. Maybe that's not realistic, but you've spent a lot of time. You've learned from a variety of different things. You've spent money on computer classes. You've tried Coursera. You've tried a few different courses in college, and it's just not sticking. Well, maybe it's just kind of not for you, and that's fine. That doesn't mean you don't have a place in sports or a place in any industry, but it's still, again, important to know what your abilities and your talents are, because everyone has an ability, everyone has a talent. It's really just about kind of finding it and being able to really put a note, and again, learning to sell yourself on what that talent happens to be, as I mentioned a few times earlier with some of my examples.
Absolutely. I love the advice piece there, and that really ties in with kind of our last few questions. I would like to know of any kind of words of advice you have for students entering the professional world, specifically in analytics or otherwise. I think your sort of non-traditional role from starting out to where you are now makes you a really kind of key person to speak on this.
Right. I think the first thing I would do, and this is something I kind of regret doing myself, or not doing myself rather, is figure out what you do want to do, because I think too often people don't necessarily have their eyes on the right prize. I've seen that with some of the people that I've kind of mentored to a certain aspect, and it's a really simple question. Like, what do you want to do in 5 years? What do you want to do in 10 years? What do you want to do? And then from there, almost work backwards to sort of fill in the blanks of what you might want to be able to do. If you do want to become a baseball general manager, and I wanted to for sure, it's, okay, well, what are the steps I need to be able to do to accomplish that? Now, again, there's only 30 of those. It's harder to be an MLB general manager than it is to become a U.S. senator. So again, realize that. And if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to work, but what do you have to do that? You probably have to work 80 hours a week, nights, weekends, and holidays for at least the next 10 years. Forget about, traveling to South America, if that's what you want to do. And again, be realistic about it. But if that's what you want to do, you go for it, because again, it's possible. And I think, we're seeing that is becoming, obviously there's a certain amount of that is like, you have to be in the Ivy League, but I think things like that even are starting to change again, especially we've become a little more conscious of things over the last year or so, that, there's going to be a little more opportunities for people with a lot of different backgrounds, not just, your Ivy League people or whatever. So again, if you want to be the next Scott Van Pelt, you probably don't need to learn how to do R, because don't even know if Scott Van Pelt knows what R is, right? So again, it's all about laser focus. Okay, if I want to do Scott Van Pelt, maybe research what his background was. He started off doing at the Golf Channel, and then kind of worked his way up, got to ESPN, and then all of a sudden now he's doing their primetime sports center. If that's what you want to do, all right, well, what are things that I need to learn how to do? Okay, well, you probably need to be pretty good on air. You probably need to be able to communicate well. You probably need to have a diverse interest level, again, because he can do golf, he can do football, he can do basketball highlights, etc. So okay, well, what does that mean? Okay, maybe that means getting into local news at your local station, whether that's college television. I'm sure a lot of different colleges. I know when I was in college, we had one at UNC. I'm sure a lot of them have college news stations that you can do. Also, there's tons of internships you can do in radio. Obviously, communications and radio stuff is a big particular major that you could do, and so that would be part of it as well. Like I mentioned, I didn't start off in sports media with a media background. I started off working at a radio station in my college town. if you want to, be the next, person who's like a gambling sharp, okay, well, you probably don't necessarily need to know how to work a soundboard. So, okay, I need to become really awesome at building out my own models. So what are you going to do to that? Okay, taking college courses, using Coursera, data camp, stuff like that, where you can learn how to do all these different machine learning techniques to be able to program that. Because again, if that's what you're interested in, that's what you should do. And again, sometimes that's going to mean taking sacrifices. I would say for me personally, I was less and less was appealing. It was not even, by the end of it, it was not even appealing for me to become a baseball general manager. Even that's kind of what I wanted to sort of do, because as I grew older, when I was out of college, just honestly out here, I got married really young. And I kind of knew that I was going to have to make sacrifices on the home front, with that whole work-life balance thing, that it just wasn't realistic for me to pursue this, because the odds are I was going to fall short. And that's just, again, part of what it is. Because again, in my position, when you work for a team, you're going to make 30 grand a year for, again, 8 to 10 years, going to be working tons of hours. You're going to have to move a lot. If a GM gets fired, you're probably getting fired too. Maybe you'll follow that person to do that. And none of this is meant to discourage. It's just meant to, put yourself in their shoes. If in 5 years you've worked a job for little to no money, you're driving, a beat up, Chevy Malibu from 10 years ago is not your idea of what you want to be doing in 5 years, then maybe it's not realistic to be able to pursue that. And again, I can go on and on for those different examples, but I would say another thing that I think is really encouraging about our space in particular is sports media is a very, very encouraging field. I've reached out to people on LinkedIn and Twitter, all these people, we're all accessible now. And I'm pretty lowly on the totem pole, let's be honest. But I get LinkedIn messages every once in a while, including from yourself, to be able to talk to you all today. And again, I think it's one of those things where you're inspired a little bit by how open people are for advice and helping out and assisting and trying to find things. And you want to do the same thing. You want to pay it forward to people who did the same for you. And that's not true in every industry, but I do think that's very true in sports media. There's been a lot of stuff like this sprouting up, right? Just, these talks and stuff like this that I think are great and fantastic. And I think help open doors for people. And again, I'm sure, they'll have my information here. I would encourage you to reach out to myself if you have any further questions. Because again, I think that's all we can do is try to kind of help the next generation. And again, that's not true in every industry. Some people are, I don't want any more competition in this field. No, thank you. People get ghosts all the time. And I'm sure there are going to be some people in sports media who do that. But I would say 9 times out of 10, people are going to respond to you. People are going to want to help you out, because again, I think that's just kind of the environment that we've kind of all harbored in this particular space. So, those would kind of be my 2 big things, would just be realistic, figure out what you want to be doing, and then follow that path, however you think maybe, again. And part of that is reaching out to people, say, hey, I really, want to do your job. How can I accomplish this goal? And again, if you're interested in my particular field, obviously, again, you have my information. I hope you've kind of enjoyed this, and I hope I've been very helpful to everyone today. But again, reach out to myself, reach out to some of the other people in the industry, reach out to people at ESPN, reach out to people at NBC Sports, reach out to people on the team side, because again, a lot of the people on the team side weren't that far off from where you are right now. There's again, I can name a dozen people right off the top of my head if I wanted to, just like people who are in their early 20s, just out of college, who are able to get these jobs. And again, they want to help the next generation, so to speak. And, kind of my last point where you tie it all together is, all right, maybe you're, some of you I'm sure are, going to be graduating, in May or whenever the spring semester ends, but maybe some of you are sophomores or juniors, or maybe even, first years. I would say even now, even if you're not quote unquote in the job searching process, or maybe, like, hey, I have some summer plans, but I want to really start looking in the fall. Look now for the job that you want. So even if you're not ready for that job right now, that kind of ties into my earlier aspect of, okay, if I really want to work for this football team, I want to be a scout. Okay, well, every job listing right now is going to have a set of requirements, right? Or suggestions, just like any job will have. Okay, so maybe let's say you check 4 of those. Let's say you check 2 of those 5 boxes off right now, right? You have to have a college degree, you have to have some work experience. Maybe you are missing 2 or 3 of the things. Maybe you need to work on your computer programming. Maybe you need to work on having some more work experience or an internship. All right, well, maybe you can't apply for that job earnestly right now, but these jobs open up all the time. Make sure you're ready for when that job comes up again, or that same job comes up with a different team, right? So, maybe the Browns are hiring this offseason. You're from Cleveland, you're a diehard Browns fan. Yeah, I'm sure it'd be awesome to work for the Browns, but I'm sure a job with the Steelers or the Ravens or the Bengals might come up in the next 3 or 4 years, the same exact job. And heck, maybe even the Browns job will come up. So make sure, even if you're not ready right now, it's helpful, I think, to look at the resumes of jobs you want. I always would copy and paste them in a Word document because, again, they expire. They'll close the position. You won't be able to see them again. Save them in a Word document, a Google Doc, whatever you want to do. Go back to them and say, okay, this summer, I want to check off this box so that going into my next semester, I have 3 of these 5 boxes now. And then, okay, over winter break, I'm going to work on getting a spring internship so that I can check off this work experience box. And then you've kind of, again, planned ahead, and then you're able to apply for that job in earnest the next time it comes up, either for that team or maybe for a different team or whatever the case may be. Or if it's a job at ESPN, the same applies. If you want to be, you want to work behind the camera doing audio, okay, maybe you don't know all the different programs, but maybe you can work on learning, the Adobe software that you need to learn to get this job when it opens up again next year. So I think, again, all those kind of in being able to combine is know what you're looking for. Also, be able to just not only guess that, but reach out to people who are able to help out, and then look for jobs that are open now. And again, maybe you don't feel confident applying to them now, but make sure the next time it opens that you're able to apply for it, and you're maybe even overqualified for that position, because I say a lot of times you almost have to be overqualified for positions. That doesn't mean to not apply for them, because I think something also that's been helpful is almost more helpful to interview for a job that I didn't get, because again, you're impressing those people, you're selling yourself to those people, and those are connections that I've made, going back 5 or 10 years now, that I am still in professional contact with. And again, so many businesses are relationship based, right? So it's always putting impression. You never know which one might be looking for your position at a different company. You might never know who you're running into. Again, that's going to apply for any particular job, but I think it's especially true in sports.
Awesome. Thank you for your candidness on that answer. I think that advice was really great. One final question I have for you. This is something that we're asking to every one of our speakers. It's a little bit out of left field and take some time if you need it, but not necessarily just in the industry or in this job. But what are you most excited for about the future?
I think the first thing I would say is basically the unpredictability of it, right? I think there's so many examples of people that have tried to predict the future and failed. And that's kind of what makes it fun, right? I think people, and I think it's especially true in sports, and it's, not to steal Scott Van Pelt's quote again, but his quote is, sports is the ultimate reality television. It's not scripted. You don't necessarily know what's going to happen. You might think that, for example, the Chiefs are going to be the dynasty of the 2020s because they have, great quarterback, et cetera. But stuff doesn't happen that way. Things go fast, and that's true both on the football field or on the basketball court. But it's also true in these industries. I mentioned a few of the things that I've talked about, right? Gambling taking over the world, maybe Apple buying the rights, and maybe you have to stream it on Apple television in 5 years. And, maybe, there's going to be tons and tons of different broadcasts. Like ESPN has tried this megacast concept, right? Where they have, 8 or 9 different things you can tune in for the same broadcast. You can have traditional broadcasters, you can have more like hip and young broadcasters, you can have kind of analytically based broadcasters. Maybe that's the future. Or maybe I'm just totally wrong. And none of this is going to happen. And the gambling thing is going to be a huge dud. And, maybe robots are broadcasting baseball games in 20 years. I don't know the answer. It's really just taking what you can do, studying it up as much as possible. But I think also it's important to just kind of every once in a while take a step back and realizing that, again, if you work in sports, there's always that excitement aspect of it. And I think some people lose that to a certain extent, but I still have it, right? I'm still living and dying with every pitch of Brewers baseball. I'm still, hoping that the Bucks don't choke in the playoffs again. I'm still hoping that the Packers don't lose in the NFC Championship game for the, 6th time in the last 10 years or whatever it is. And that's part of the joy of sports, and it's part of the reason that millions of people watch sports, and it's part of the reason that millions of people do not watch people that work at banks do their job, right? And again, I think that's so much part of it. We talk about it in the industry as kind of, there's a sports tax, right? Mostly around things I mentioned like work-life balance, and salaries are a little bit lower, right? I could be doing a similar job to mine at a bank or at a real estate mogul or an investment firm or whatever the case may be, I could be making a little bit more money. I'd be probably working better hours, but I do this because I really enjoy my job and I enjoy being able to do some of the things that I'm able to accomplish on a day-to-day basis. And again, I think there's always an aspect of that you need to have in the sports industry, because again, you are making sacrifices, and I think it's important to acknowledge them. So I think, long story short, I would say it's really just kind of the unpredictability of it all. I would say personally, I think the gambling stuff is actually going to be really cool. I know there's some, old hats who are a little skeptical of it, but I think it's going to be awesome that, let's say, for example, I have a lot of, I've moved around a lot, so I have friends in a lot of different cities. It's going to be cool if where I live in Chicago, if I'm watching the Super Bowl and I have friends in North Carolina and friends in Los Angeles, and we're all watching the game, and we can sync it up and we can try to predict what happens on the next play. And if I'm in an app and I say that it's going to be a 10-yard pass, and if I'm right, then I just, made $25. And then we just keep doing the same thing on every play. And let's say you and I, Jackson, are in a home run competition and I pick the right guy and he hits a home run. And I think you've seen this in the advertising, really, right? If you remember, back 4 or 5 years ago when FanDuel and DraftKings had commercials, almost every other commercial was one of those commercials when you watch an NFL game. And before it was like, hey, this is how you become a millionaire. And, you kind of learned that, well, that's actually not really true. It's more, and I think they've now emphasized the social aspect and the aspect of like, hey, think of it as just like an entertainment. It's just like going to a bar and spending, $30 to $40 on a few beers and some chicken wings while you're watching the game with your friends. Now you're going to be at home. You're able to save some money on the beer, but now I'm using my phone, and that's, I spent $30, and sometimes I'm going to win $60. Most of the time, I'm probably going to lose money. But it's really going to be sort of enhancing that social aspect of it all. And that's kind of why we all got into this business in the first place. And I'm sure even of those of you who maybe aren't 100% interested in the industry per se, but are still big sports fans, that's why you watch. You want to be able to prove to your friends more than they do about a particular sport, or you called that play, or you knew that the Patriots are going to win that last week, or whatever the case may be. That's kind of why we all get into this in the first place. So.
Absolutely. That was awesome. Well, thank you so much for all the insight you've provided and for all the time that you've given us tonight. This was really incredible. I think our students are going to really enjoy this. And I hope to hear from you again in the future very soon.
Awesome. Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking with you today, Jackson. And again, as I mentioned, feel free to reach out to me with any questions or anything I could do to help. Just want to try to spread any kind of knowledge I can, and I'm sure I'll kind of learn as much from you all as you've been able to hopefully glean from me today. So I'd love to sort of know what the new crop of sports analysts are coming up with these days, because I'm sure that it's going to be kind of the next wave of the future.
Awesome. Thanks again.